Welcome. I'm your host, Steve Walsh. Last summer, we looked at racial bias and white supremacy in the military. Even then, I knew there was at least one more conversation looking at the role of the veteran community and what it plays in confronting hate. Uh, the dangers became front page news when veterans were first implicated in a plot to kidnap the governor of Michigan. Then in January, a number of veterans were charged in the siege of the Capitol. Large veterans groups seem caught off guard. Traditionally, many of them have struggled with inclusion. We'll look at ways that veterans groups might help de-radicalize members whose beliefs have led them to extremism. Joining me is Richard Brookshire. He's co-founder and executive director of the Black Veterans Project. John Clark III, he is a recently retired naval commander who writes about being an African-American in the Navy. Tony McAleer was once a neo-Nazi. He founded Life After Hate in 2011 to help others leave white extremist groups. He's author of the book, The Cure for Hate. Pete Simi is a professor of sociology at Chapman University. He's an expert on racial extremism and has looked at why these groups target people in the military specifically. Akila Templeton, she is CEO of Veterans Village in San Diego, which helps veterans with problems ranging from addiction to homelessness. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. I'll try to keep them up, or actually put them in the Q&A if you could, and I'll try to keep up. So let's start with John Clark. You came into the Navy as a sailor in 1986 and rose to commander, retiring in 2018. Before we even get into extremism, I'd like to get a sense of what it can be like to deal with veterans groups when they haven't really looked at diversity as a major issue. After the death of George Floyd at the hands of police, you had an issue with the Naval Postgraduate School Alumni Association. John, can you tell me a little bit about your experience? John, are you there? Police, you had an issue with the
There's a little bit of a feedback.
School Alumni Association. John, can you tell me a little bit about your experience?
My experience with the Alumni Association actually began when the Alumni Association came out to Hawaii to try to grow the membership here in Hawaii. They announced that they would be sending out a new publication called Faces of NPS, and it would have the previous members, the staff, and the students of the Alumni Association and the school. Well, imagine my surprise when I received that first periodical, and there was 0 faces of color in the periodical. So I promptly wrote an email to them the same day that I received that particular periodical. Didn't receive a response. I sent up a follow-up response, and the response that I received back said that they would explore ways to reach out to underrepresented youth through STEM events and high school, college internships. But that's not the problem. The problem is not recruitment. The problem is retention. And mind you, this was before George Floyd was murdered. So it wasn't something in response to something that was going on nationally. I found it hard to believe that the Naval Postgraduate School Alumni Association was sending out something called Faces of NPS with 0 minority members. And once I pulled the string, I found out that they had 0 members of color on their advisory council, although they said that they were representing diverse perspectives, and they had 0 people of color on their board of trustees. So I asked them if they could include at least 2 people within the next 30 days that self-identified as people of color. Although they said that they were representing a diverse perspective, and they had 0 people of color on their board of trustees. So I asked them if they could include.
So, John, we seem to have an issue with you're kind of feeding back on us here a little bit. I don't know if we can solve that really quickly. Okay, so maybe it stops when we mute you. Let's see if we can I can kind of walk through this a little bit. So you found out they had really nobody on the advisory group, nobody on the board of directors who were people of color, and they were talking about diversity. When you pointed out that this was an issue, did you get a sense from them? I mean, what was their reaction? I found out they had really nobody on the advisory group, nobody on the board of directors were people of color, and they were talking about diversity. When you pointed out that this was an issue, did you get a sense from them? I mean, what was their reaction?
Well, initially they were very defensive, but then I got sort of a legalistic response. And I was somewhat disappointed with that. But I will say in the end, within 30 days on the advisory council, they did actually invite a 4-star admiral, Admiral Haney, on their staff, as well as a person from industry, another person of color who identified as African American. So as of today, they have 2 people of color on their advisory council, but they only have all white members and 1 Asian member on the much larger board of trustees.
All right, so John, we're still getting this sense with this feeding back here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move on, and maybe we can solve that issue and come back. And I'm going to move on to Richard Brookshire, if I could really briefly here. You're the co-founder and executive director of the Black Veterans Project. You created the Black Veterans Project. It's really only it's still pretty new. Richard, what was the opening for this group? Why did you think there was a need for the Black Veterans Project?
Yeah, well, first, thanks for having me. So I started, we're a baby org, right? So this is very much a startup. But what I noticed was there wasn't a space for post 9/11 Black vets or minority vets to really have more provocative conversations about the state of racial justice, the state of racial affairs and discrimination in the military. But I also noticed that there was a disconnect from older Black vet organizations, right? That there was also a dearth of digital presence around this, burgeoning, I guess, national conversation about racial justice that's been happening over the course of the last decade. That certainly has kind of been on the uptick in the last few years. And so for me, it was like, I'm a storyteller, I'm a policy wonk. When I transitioned out of the military, I went to policy school, I worked in city government, worked a bunch of electoral campaigns. And I'd always wanted to work in the racial justice space, but was waiting until I felt like there was not only just a window of opportunity, but a place where I could add deep value. And so understanding that a lot of vet organizations, especially storied Black veteran organizations, had mostly focused on service delivery and building camaraderie amongst Black vets, there had been a dearth of real due diligence around research, around getting their hands on data, around being able to really tie that to really strong storytelling, and then centralizing that as a catalyst for advocacy. And so, we're a baby org and we're really just getting started on that. But our mission really is to start a national dialogue around racial justice in the military, to be part and parcel and to be the go-to organization for media, for stakeholders, to not only just learn, the historical, background of this issue and kind of tie this linear experience among Black vets to the present day, but to also kind of just be a hub and a voice for Black vets to be able to tell their stories.
So you were a former Army medic here. You were in Afghanistan in 2009. I think it's really important. We're talking a lot about the Capitol siege and the veterans that were involved in that, but these issues don't begin or end with the siege on the Capitol. What was your experience? What did you see as a medic in 2009?
Yeah, well, I was in Afghanistan in 2011, but I joined in 2009. No worries. And what did I see? I mean, I saw, I was stationed in Germany. I saw a deep fascination with Hitler, with Nazism, just kind of a pervasive kind of just undertone, right? We know that, it says, or at least in the doctrine, that like you should be apolitical somewhat in the military, but that's not true, right? Like people bring their full selves to bear. But there's much more room for like provocative, conservative rhetoric. I was rife with conspiracy theories. Very rare that I went to work where there wasn't one inappropriate dialogue, sometimes crossing the border into just full out racism. But, there was also this kind of this deep distrust of government, which was odd because you're serving said government. I was serving under Obama at the time. And so you could just kind of get a sense of this racial animus. But even amongst, my fellow troops, I felt that I recognized that the majority of Black folk that I was serving among were in service-oriented roles, understanding that that's a legacy, right, of before the military was even integrated, seeing a dearth of representation in the higher enlisted ranks, certainly in the officer corps, just anecdotal conversations from those that I worked alongside, feeling as though they were being marginalized in their careers and not really feeling that they had a voice, and certainly feeling like they didn't want to, raise any red flags for fear of repercussions, for fear of kind of tainting themselves essentially as like a problem soldier. So that's some of what I experienced.
So when you got back after serving in Afghanistan, you saw a story in the newspaper, right? Someone had gone and they had stabbed an African American. Tell me about that story.
Yes. I think his name was Dylan. I haven't committed it to memory, to be frank, but our careers mirrored each other in very just uncomfortable ways. Like, right. So we had never been stationed specifically in the same unit, but we went to Fort Leonard Wood for basic training at the same time, had been stationed in Baumholder at the same time. Baumholder is a very small standalone brigade, infantry brigade at the time, deployed to Afghanistan at the same time, got out of the military at the same time. We're the same age as well. And so, I was just riding the train to work one day, just in many ways, and I think it's important to state, like, I joined on the heels of the first Black president and transitioned out of the military on the heels of Trump, right? So I think that was traumatic for most people, but for me, as kind of a young, idealistic soldier, that was a traumatic kind of transition. And then also transitioning into the state that the country was in at the time, where the state of racial justice was just so bad, essentially, and really trying to figure out how I fit in, how to make sense of it. So I was reading the paper one day and I read his story and I just broke down, because I think for me, why I got so emotional was because it all kind of came together, right? Like all of the things that I had seen and then seeing what it led to, right? And then
this was somebody you knew personally, and he had he had grabbed a sword or a knife, and he had
been radicalized. I did not know him personally. I think I want to make a correction there.
Okay.
But we were stationed on a very small base, so it's very likely that we ate chow next to each other. But I think that's beside the point whether I knew him personally. I think it was just an example, right, of how radicalization can kind of fester. And he, after he got out, and to a certain degree, he may have been radicalized while he was in service, right? I mean, many of vets kind of come in with they're predisposed to being racist in some respects, or being racially biased. But he came out, he got involved in like the neo-Nazi movement. He decided that he wanted to come to New York at the time with the explicit intent of killing a Black person. That was just like his intent. He had a sword and he instead went and stabbed a homeless Black, I believe the man was a former veteran as well, but he was homeless, and stabbed him to death.
It was not somebody he knew?
No,
he had no prior connection to him?
Random stranger, which is not as I guess infrequent as we would hope, right? Like there have been Black vets that have been killed by white nationalists, by racists over the course of the last few years, let alone the last few decades. And that's something that we just have to start to reckon with in an honest way.
But these are some of these sort of semi-anonymous things that happen that don't grab front page headlines.
Yeah.
But they do happen. So you work with the Black Veterans Project. Do you work with other veterans groups? Did you try to get involved with other veterans groups once you came home?
Well, I mean, like so many vets, I couldn't wait to get out, right? Like I wanted to get my benefits and run for the hills. And so I actually never thought I'd be working in the vet space at all. But when I started the Black Veteran Project, I had the opportunity to go work at IVA, Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America. And it was really where I think I got my chops, right? Like I learned to, not only just how the vet space could laid out, and even just before that, saying that like, even as someone who was a little bit proactive about trying to find community, it was very difficult to find community. There is such a wide chasm, a widening actually civilian military divide. So there's so few people that really understand my experience. But even trying to connect to vets writ large, there was no hub, right? And then the hubs that did exist, they leaned to, toward the kinds of people that I just kind of tolerated while I was in the military, but didn't necessarily want to foster community with post-service, right? Those kind of the conspiracy laden conservatives, the kind of fratty, the frat boys, essentially, of the military. And so, and they kind of predominate in the vet space. So anyways, I was involved at IVA and learned a lot there. And in the last few years have been really building out and cultivating relationships with more storied Black vet organizations. So one thing I just want to mention quickly is there's been an organization, just understanding that as Black vets, we have to lead the conversation, but we also have to get organized. Last summer, the House Veteran Affairs Committee convened a roundtable of local, state, and national level Black veteran organizations, and born out of that was the Black Veteran Empowerment Council, of which BVP now sits under. And it's really, like I said, a way for us to start to convene in a way that's never really happened before, share resources, share information, and create a centralized kind of advocacy.
And get some of the stories out here that just have not come to light in the past. What's it like? Is the veteran community a welcoming community overall for African Americans? Is this, when we're talking about these kinds of issues like dealing with extremism, are people excited to hear about this? Do they want to get involved?
Well, I certainly think I think there's a misconception, right, that everybody that serves in the military might lean conservative, that like that though we know that minorities,
it's definitely not true.
Definitely not true.
Yeah.
And so it's about like cultivating community. And so I mean, I get emails every single day from people that are excited at even the prospect of our work when we're just beginning, have zero resources, donate if you can. But like, and then just kind of just getting it off the ground, right? So that's exciting. As far as the more storied vet organizations, even, for instance, something like the American Legion, Black vets have always had to kind of create their own lanes in these institutions whilst also being marginalized within. There's a long legacy of racism that even dates back to last year when, a senior leader had to step down because she felt racially aggrieved, and felt like the work that she was wanting to kind of raise up in the American Legion was being marginalized, right? And you also have folk who help lead some of these vet organizations that very much are in support of the insurrectionist kind of Trump movement, right? So that's an uncomfortable truth, but it's a fact. And we certainly can't just wait for them to catch up to speed. We have to force that.
But it's a real spectrum here. I mean, when you think of things like the American Legion or the VFW, the average age of their members at this point are in their 70s. So this is it's, if nothing else, a generational thing. But do you feel the newer groups are a little more open, a little more accepting, a little more welcoming?
I'll say the younger groups are welcoming. They're also ambitious, right? I mean, I think that just goes with being young and kind of wanting to see the world in new lights and embracing possibility in certain respects. So yeah, I mean, I definitely think there's an organization. It's funny because I read a piece by Newt Gingrich today on Fox News, and he was talking about the danger of these like young woke veterans. And I thought it was funny and telling, and it's just like, okay, we're doing something right. If we're pissing Newt Gingrich off and we're just getting started, we're doing something right.
So there was a 2017 Command Climate Survey. I think you know this one. It came out of the Pentagon. Nearly a third of African-American service members reported experiencing racial discrimination or harassment or both within a 12-month period. We don't know all of the data. We only have this one slice from 2017. Does that 2017 data ring true to you? And do those attitudes overflow into the veteran community?
Well, certainly. I think both. They ring true, and they certainly overflow. And if anything, because you have that intergenerational existence in the vet space that is often somewhat overlooked in our generation, that we fold into a community, it's probably even more pervasive, right, in the vet space. I think the second question was, I apologize. What was it?
Do these attitudes overflow into the veteran community?
Yeah, so I mean, yes, they do. They do. I think there was the first question. I apologize that I didn't answer, but yes, they definitely overflow.
Okay, and that, did it match your experience when you were in the service?
Yes, it matched my experience.
Okay.
Oh, as far as the data that you're talking about, like we found out about the existence of this racial bias climate survey from a whistleblower within DOD. And so we really kind of did some due diligence alongside some reporters, the reporter at Reuters, who really kind of brought it all to light, and that forced the DOD to have to respond. But yeah, they only released one singular year, right? So we know that the careers of Black vets are certainly affected in more ways than what this one singular year with these very specific kind of careful questions around racial bias than what they would actually show. So we're really pushing for the complete release. We know that data is a starting point, right? And if the military, the DoD wants to really take this seriously, they have to afford us access to that data. I want to give everyone else the time to talk, but I appreciate those questions.
Well, I'm certainly, and we're kind of getting out of sequence here because, just some technical issues, which happen all the time. But yeah, why don't we do it? I'm going to move on here right now to Pete Simi. He's a professor of sociology at Chapman University. You're an expert on racial extremism, and you've looked at these groups and why they target people with a military background specifically. I know the raw data, at least 36 people of the 250 people who have been charged in the Capitol siege had a military or law enforcement background. That doesn't include Ashley Babbitt, who is the Air Force veteran who was shot climbing through an interior window in the Capitol building. So Pete, tell me, so why do they target veterans? Why is that important? And is it just a coincidence that we're seeing so many people that were involved in the Capitol siege?
No, well, first, thanks for having me. And it's definitely not a coincidence. This is a long-standing pattern that we're seeing play out in terms of the January 6th incident. So this is really not new news and shouldn't be any surprise, really. We can really look at this kind of in terms of three pathways as far as how this all plays out, as far as the relationship between military experience and right-wing extremism. One, we have a really old strategy that's been used by right-wing extremist groups to essentially encourage their members to join the military as part of what they call an infiltration strategy. So that is, people who are already adopted extremist ideology are going and seeking out military experience. And that's part of this larger strategy of infiltrating society that also includes law enforcement, includes education, and essentially society as a whole. So that's one facet of the relationship. Another facet is that you have some individuals, and I've seen this firsthand in some of my field work, in particular with a person by the name of Wade Page, where individuals join the military who are not extremists, but during their time in the military, they become indoctrinated. So for example, with Page, he joined the US Army in 1992, not long after high school. Eventually, he ends up at Fort Bragg around 95. And at that point, he meets somebody on base who's already a neo-Nazi that introduces him to neo-Nazi propaganda and music. And at that point, Page becomes, he says when I had interviewed him several years later, he said it made sense to him. It clicked. And in fact, what he told me was that if you don't go in the military as a racist, you're sure to come out as one. And I specifically recall that because I'd heard that saying before.
What does that mean? I mean, well, why would that be true? Because that's certainly not true of everyone. Or even a majority.
Not true of everyone. Yeah. So part of that is his justification and rationalization for adopting those beliefs. But what he was trying to say was that there's an anti-white agenda that's prominent in the military, and he started experiencing that and seeing reverse discrimination. So from his vantage point, again, this is his perspective, it made sense to adopt these beliefs. But I do mention that because I'd actually heard that earlier in my life as a child. And I'm somewhat embarrassed to say, but I had a relative tell me the exact same thing who'd been in the Army as a way to try and educate me that there is reverse discrimination against whites. There is an anti-white agenda. Now, it didn't have much impact on me, but I thought he was.
And I think the basis there is that some people, they come from this homogeneous atmosphere where they're only around other people that are just like them. They get into in a more diverse environment, and that certainly includes the U.S. military. Some people, it's an eye opener of just like, how many more possibilities there are out there. But some people, a sliver of people, get really afraid. That this really seems to bother them.
Yeah, exactly. For Page, he left the military in '98, and it was after his time in the military that he really goes head first and becomes really immersed in neo-Nazi networks after the military. And he's really embraced by folks across the U.S. and actually in Europe. Eventually, he becomes heavily involved in the music scene. I meet him around 2000 and spend a couple years doing interviews with him and observing his life. And then in 2012, he walks into a Sikh temple in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, armed with a 9mm handgun and opens fire and murders 6 people who were at temple that day, and leaves the temple, gets into a firefight with law enforcement, and then eventually takes his own life, shoots himself in the head.
So bottom line, this did not start in January. This is something that has long and serious roots. So tell me about some of the groups that were active at the Capitol. We've looked at extremism in the military sort of in general, and things like the Boogaloo Boys and things like that. But there were some specific groups that were very active January 6th, like the Oath Keepers, right?
Yeah, so the Oath Keepers definitely had a pretty substantial presence January 6th, and they've been around for quite a while. They were founded in 2009. They have a very strong military and law enforcement association, and so that's a major part of their focus in terms of recruitment. Not exclusively, but that certainly is a major kind of focus for them. You also had 3%ers with President January 6th, and
that's another of them from the militia movement. Another group from the militia movement.
Yeah, exactly. Based on the idea that 3% of the 3% of the population during Revolutionary America were the patriots who basically helped found the country that fought the revolution. But so they see themselves as very wrapped up in the notion of upholding the Constitution, but there's a much more darker kind of layer to this once you start peeling away the outer surface part about the pro-America patriotism and so forth. There's a lot of other things going on in groups like the Oath Keepers and 3%ers.
But both of those groups that you just mentioned, they tend to have a strong military penchant. They either covet people who are veterans or have that military experience, or they present themselves as military, as with body armor and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. And there, for some veterans, and again, we're talking about a segment, and it's not clear what size that segment is, but certainly not entirely. No. So we want to be careful in terms of that. But a segment finds some kind of familiarity and comfort in the fact that a lot of these right-wing extremist groups are essentially paramilitary in their structure and organization and the language that they use. And because they are really confirming and really kind of reinforcing a certain kind of identity in terms of, really valuing military experience and saying how important, and we really want to welcome that.
So I want to get into a little bit more into QAnon and how this has factored in it. And I will tell you, when I was first really started paying attention to this is when I was doing stories about Ashley Babbitt, who was the San Diego Air Force veteran who was killed at the Capitol, climbing in a window. She was an adherent of QAnon. I think we might even have a picture of her with a Q shirt on. This grew up in the Trump administration, but the QAnon really has some really long and very dark roots. There's a real anti-Semitic root to this, isn't there? Tell me.
Yeah, absolutely. In many respects, QAnon is kind of recycling various tropes that have been around in the kind of universe of right-wing extremism for a long time, and more broadly, and certainly anti-Semitism is one of them. You see a lot of references to the Rothschild family, which is essentially code word for the international Jew, quote unquote, which is this idea that there's essentially a small international Jewish conspiracy that controls world affairs. So you see also things related to sovereign citizenship and posse comitatus ideas about the county sheriff being the highest law of the land. And they talk about America's actually not a republic anymore. It's actually a corporation. These are ideas that have been around long before we ever heard about Q.
Right, but this whole idea that there's this deep state that's made up from everyone from Hillary Clinton to the intelligence community to Tom Hanks to the media, and there were supposed to be arrests here. They were going to happen maybe at the inauguration if you were looking at some of the chatter that was going on. And
they're still talking about now early March 5th, Trump 2021 is going to be his new term will start.
So right, so that's the thing. It struck me as like after the inauguration, this would go away. That nothing happened. No one intervened. Nobody made Donald Trump president, and that this would start to fade away. But it doesn't look like that's happened. Some people look at that and feel they were duped just looking at the chatter.
Sure.
But then others seem to have doubled down, and they're still going. And this is really not going away, is this?
No, and even if Q were to disappear tomorrow, which it's not going to, but if that were to miraculously happen, the ideas are still circulating widely and broadly. And so, we get focused sometimes too much on specific groups. We're dealing with a worldview here that's deeply penetrated, American society, but actually globally as well, because this is a global problem. So a lot of times I think we focus too much on the groups and not recognize that this is a broad worldview that this represents.
Right. But though in the case of Q, was it May in 2019, the FBI put out a bulletin from the Phoenix office describing this conspiracy theory as a domestic terror threat. And that I know at Southern Poverty Law Center, there have been several cases where this has turned violent. People have abducted children thinking they're saving them from child protective services because this is supposed to be some sort of cult that abducts children and maybe drinks their blood and all sorts of things. So, I mean, it's very detailed and it goes in all sorts of different directions. Am I right?
Yeah. I mean, it's quite, involved and detailed. And there's an aspect to it, I think, for some of the folks who get into it, that it's almost like they're playing some kind of social mediated video game where, Q puts out these little codes and they try and break the codes. And for those that are really heavily, invested in it, I think there is a real kind of, it might be the wrong word, but entertainment value to it in terms of they really find it pleasurable to be invested in these kind of things. And of course, they also see themselves as, helping save children and really, having this special insight about the evils that are all around us. And most people don't realize about those evils, but they have that special awareness.
And I from what some of the things I've been reading, it's gotten involved in all sorts of things. You could go on self-help groups. You can go into groups that are dealing with like yoga classes and start picking up on some of these theories. So it's quite fungible. It goes off in all of these different directions, and it's not really showing signs of dying out.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the more frightening aspects of Q is how much it really did spread, essentially like wildfire. And it appears that we're talking about millions of adherents in some form or another. Again, not all the folks, there's some folks that are kind of on the fringes, you might call them Q curious, and then there are those that are deeply invested. So it's a full range of involvement, but we are talking about not a few folks, we're talking about a very large number here.
And these threats don't seem to be going, not only are they not going away, but this has changed so much, even in the last year. These groups seem to have evolved rapidly. I mean, where are we headed, do you think?
Well, I think, there's a lot of aspects to it, but as far as the violence, what I'm most concerned about kind of post January 6th are two things. That was a major kind of mass mobilization that, turned violent, and that will have a radicalizing impact for some of those that were either directly involved or were vicariously involved in that they watched it on live stream or they watched the various, video clips that are readily available. And for some individuals, either in small cells or single actors, they're going to want to further what we saw on January 6th and continue to strike out violently as a kind of representative of the cause. And of course, they have a long history of doing that. So, and we've seen that happen with similar types of kind of events like January 6th, where it radicalizes the individuals who directly participated, and they commit even more violence after the fact.
Okay, I'm going to go on here to Tony McAleer. He's the author of The Cure for Hate. He was once a neo-Nazi. He now helps others leave white extremist groups. And we've talked a little bit with the professor about why there is an interest in veterans, but you were in the military yourself, Tony. What is the appeal of this kind of extremism? Are people really people are being targeted. But what is the appeal if you're someone who has been a veteran?
Well, I think the appeal of people that have been in the military or who are in the military or encouraged to go into the military, obviously, is the weapons training. I was involved in a reserve unit in Canada, and I did it strictly for the weapons training. I didn't talk to anybody about my beliefs when I was in there. Just did it strictly for the weapons training. And I think that there's a sense of patriotism, a sense of nationalism, which is not problematic, that many veterans have, and that sense of duty and patriotism can often be sort of manipulated, and to take it to another step. At what point does nationalism become ultranationalism? At what point does sort of the healthy view of wanting to get involved and serve the community, at what point does that actually become something much more sinister?
So I certainly don't want to paint with a broad brush or to demonize everyone whose politics might be to the right of center as somehow being an extremist. Or even somebody who might have come across this stuff on Twitter and the like, and may have talked about it somewhat and just sort of picked up at the outer edge. But where did these beliefs become a real problem? Where is that line where you really have to take this seriously? If your friends or family or maybe your buddy starts talking about this stuff, where's that line where this really becomes a problem?
There's some nuances to that, but I think the obvious place to start is the mobilization to violence, and that's violence against property or individuals that are expressed through these views. And we let's not lose sight of the fact that the young men and women who've served in the armed forces overseas, we've put them in extreme situations to do extreme things. And there isn't always the resources sort of help put that back together once they come home. One of the very first people that we helped at Life After Hate was indeed a veteran who reached out to us, and he was starting to have ideations of, I think he'd seen friends blown up and really hated Muslims. That was his motivation, and he was starting to have ideations of going to the local Muslim center and doing something, and it was kind of really touch and go with duty to report. And two of our team went out there to see him, and we actually introduced him to the imam at that Muslim center, and they became the best of friends. But his experience overseas had really set him up to fall into this ideology, and it, on the hopeful side, it can be fixed. The imam told us, told our guys, I've got 15 minutes for them. You can, bring them down. 2 hours later, they're crying and hugging, and it's really emotional event. So let's not lose sight of the fact that we need to help the veterans when they come back, because they've been through pretty extreme things.
Yeah, and it sounds like you work seriously one-on-one with people, and you really put in the time to really sort of hear them out and bring them through this process. But if we were going to do this on a larger scale and really look at ways that you might, be able to reach out to a number of people and kind of replicate that experience, do you think it can be done? Can this be done at a scale?
Absolutely. And I left Life After Hate a year ago.
Right.
But I think what Life After Hate did a great job of was providing proof of concept. And I think that the solution isn't to make Life After Hate or an organization like that bigger and with thousands of counselors. Let's look at the resources that are already in place in different communities, at whether it be at the county level or the state level, and with some training, sometimes they don't even, they've got the tools to deal with traumas and dehumanization and PTSD and stuff like that. They just often need they need the subject demystified. It's like, a neo-Nazi, they sort of freak out and don't know how to deal with it. But if we give them a bit of training and demystify it, then those, they can be skilled up, and I think that's how we scale it. And there's tons of resources out there. They just need to be marshaled towards this.
I'm trying to go through some of the questions here to see if we can get some of these in here. And is anyone going to discuss accountability and solutions? So I guess we're doing a little bit of that right now. But when we talk about accountability, though, it's not always a matter of sort of holding people's hands. When you're talking about like what happened on January 6th, law enforcement is part of that, simply holding people accountable, right? Tony?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as we have to hold people accountable for the things that they've done, but at the same time, we can't lose our sense of compassion in that. So I may despise the ideology, I may despise the activity, but I never despise the human being. And I think compassion, when it's paired up with healthy boundaries and healthy boundaries and consequences, and that's where the accountability piece comes in. When you put those two together, they're very powerful. It's a very powerful combination, and it's just really key that we, through the process of grappling with these extreme political issues, that we don't lose our sense of compassion in society at the same time.
And I'm being told that don't try to confront people and call their beliefs silly or ridiculous. Don't ridicule, even if it sounds kind of crazy to you. You're not going to get very far with people if you come in challenging their beliefs and QAnon or any of these other things.
Well, I think that the issue is, and Pete referenced it, a couple of times, they're invested in these conspiracy theories, and I think the challenge is, it's not just what's the ideas that are in the head. The challenge is when ideology and identity become intertwined, right? So when you're going to challenge their ideology, you're in fact also challenging their identity. It's not just what they think, it's who they are. When I was involved, it was what I watched, what I listened to, it was the friends I hung out with, it was as much a lifestyle as was ideas. So people get very defensive when you challenge their identity. And I say to people, just try and have a conversation with someone where you're only asking questions. And it's amazing what if you want to practice it, instead of making statements, ask questions. And when we provide a safe space for people to express themselves, because quite often there's a legitimate grievance underneath. Whatever it is, it's real to them, and the solutions that they're seeking to cure that grievance may be completely out of whack. But there's often sometimes a real or perceived grievance there, but often there's nobody. They haven't had a chance to speak to somebody about it, and that's something that I've heard over and over and over again. And I just need someone to talk to about this, and we provide that safe space for people to be vulnerable. And express themselves. That's when the ego defenses come down and the walls come down. But there's nothing quick or silver bullet or overnight. It's a lot of one-on-one.
You'll have to stay with it. This is not one conversation you're going to have with somebody. And I think it was NPR reporting where they said that the common denominator among most of these people that were charged in January 6th, it was not that they were a veteran or any other particular group. It was financial trouble. People were in financial distress, and that when people are in financial distress, I would assume they're more vulnerable to these ideologies. All right, so Tony, I'm going to move on here to Akila Templeton here. She's the CEO of Veterans Village in San Diego. They work with veterans who are experiencing all sorts of crises, from homelessness, drug addiction. is moving people away from violent ideology, Akila? Is this another one of those needs, do you think?
Hi, Steve.
Hi.
Is that our job, right?
Yeah.
Well, as you mentioned, typically organizations like ours are concerned about a very specific set of problems. So we are typically working with veterans to ensure a successful reintegration back into society. And so we're concerned with things like improving the quality of life overall for the veteran and the veteran's family. We're looking at housing, employment, physical health, mental health, trauma, suicide prevention. We teach life skills and coping strategies. And so while we may not come out and say directly that we teach people not to hate or that we teach people not to be racist, we might on any given day witness how these beliefs manifest in the veteran's life. And so what we see are symptoms like isolation and difficulty engaging and difficulty resolving conflict, difficulty managing anger, problems with family and with relationships, and maybe even involvement in the criminal justice system. And so the problem becomes that many of the interventions that are currently in use might require looking at or challenging the core belief. And I know that Tony was talking about this a little bit earlier. But how do you do that if it's rooted in the person's politics or in their religious beliefs? And so that's what makes this problem slightly different. Extremists firmly believe in the morality of the cause that they are supporting. They believe that their intentions are good and that in and of itself justifies the behavior. And so when people believe that the end justifies the means, you're dealing with a different challenge entirely. It's consequentialism, where morality is sort of measured, strictly by the consequences. And so it's the belief that if the act itself produces a good outcome, then the act is moral. And so for the violent extremist, something like storming the Capitol is a moral act. It's something that will ultimately produce a good outcome, and so it's not wrong. And so, I guess your question is, how do we tackle that, or is it our responsibility to tackle that?
Yeah.
I don't know, because in some ways, it might be viewed as un-American to suggest that we need to treat political affiliation, right, or religious affiliation or belonging to a particular group. And so our focus, now is really to consider how the belief is showing up in the veteran's life and to assess the level of risk, when we think about that person's ability to move, successfully through life and to be a member of a community at large.
So I guess I should have backed up and asked you the simple question. Do you see this in your everyday practice here, working with veterans? When you're trying to place people in get them off the streets or trying to deal with drug addiction, do you hear these beliefs among your clients?
I don't know that they show up in the way that you're describing. We haven't necessarily seen an uptick, in hate speech or rhetoric or this type of violence. And, I'm assuming that is likely because the veterans in our programs have the ability to form connection, once they enter into our programs. And that was something that Richard, I think, touched on earlier, just the importance of connection.
So I'm going to tell you a story. I think it was 2019. I did this story. It was a VA story. It was about the role that shame played in the treatment of PTSD. I talked with a veteran who had a terrible story, and he was really struggling with it. He had been in Iraq. A car was coming toward his checkpoint. He had to make a split-second decision, open fire on the car. Turned out it was a grandfather and grandkids in the car, and he was incredibly traumatized by this. And we did a whole story about it, and and talked to researchers and the like, and then the folks at the VA that were treating him. And then this last summer, during the Black Lives Matter movement, he was driving around East County with a full Nazi flag on the back of his SUV. He was showing up at grocery stores and the like. Another news crew caught up with him and asked him why, and he said it was a protest because of that. He was protesting Black Lives Matter, and I just went like, wow, I did not hear any of those beliefs when I talked to him and interviewed him at length about this very traumatic situation and his treatment. So is this a situation where in many ways people just may not know that these views are out here? We're just not going there?
I maybe, I think that we have to be, somewhat careful with connecting, trauma and the experience that the person has in the military with a tendency, to be more violent or to engage in, radical extremism. I think that, there are certain things that happen that might make a veteran more vulnerable. But certainly the issue that, I know that there's a focus on veterans because many of the people involved in the events on January 6th were veterans. The person who, was from San Diego here was murdered. I shouldn't say murdered. She was
shot.
killed, shot. It's difficult because I think that many people are vulnerable. It's not just the veteran community. This is something that we see, happening in many circles among many groups of people who are just feeling, hopeless and helpless.
So is this a conversation that the veteran community and people who work and care about vets are people having this conversation now? Have they been having this conversation up until this point?
This is a very new topic. It's not one that's really being discussed in provider circles at all. As I was preparing for this evening, I talked with lots of folks. I even sought the counsel of our local VA, and they confirmed that this is not really a subject that is coming up a lot in our circle, veteran service organizations. I know that there has been some attention with active duty personnel, military personnel, but in veteran circles, no, I don't know that we've sounded the alarm just yet.
Sure, and we're talking about the new Secretary of Defense has called for a 60-day stand down to look at extremism within the ranks, and they've already been upfront that they believe they'll probably find more than they already know exists right now. So it's not something certainly that could be happening just among active duty, but not impacting the veteran community. These are two intertwined communities. So is the veteran community kind of behind the curve here now at this point?
No, I don't think so. I think that it's taboo. I do also think that, since we tend to focus on, the symptoms, right? We deal with that. And then you think about, mission, the stated mission of the VA, which is to care for the veteran. And so we're in the business of providing care, and so I don't know that we're at a place where we've taken, accepted this as one of those areas that we need to tackle. I don't know that, any of us were prepared for this.
Yeah. And there's not a lot of...
We certainly weren't holding groups on these topics specifically. But, I think that now the best that we can do is to find ways to apply existing interventions to new and unforeseen problems that are now happening.
And that would be my next question. And if you did start tackling this, what would you do? And what would that look like? I'm thinking in terms of maybe even the buddy system that is used for like veteran suicide, where you have somebody who just checks on a friend to see if they're okay. Could things like that be adapted to looking at whether or not somebody is gone down a rabbit hole, and they're isolating themselves from friends and families and concentrating more on a conspiracy than the people around them.
Well, I think if you had asked me that a year ago or 2 years ago, I'd say, yeah, absolutely. We should be, really focusing in on how to solve this problem. But I think that it's difficult to talk about this problem specifically in a vacuum. There are several crises sort of happening simultaneously. Right now, we have the pandemic and then the political turmoil and all of those things, and those things sort of contribute to this problem. And so I don't know that we're tackling that problem specifically. I think that we may be just really in crisis mode. And I add also that what makes this more complicated is the fact that practitioners and providers and those of us that are charged with caring for veterans are experiencing the crisis as well, right? And so we're trying to keep our staff sane and keep the veterans, on the right path at the same time. And so it's a very difficult endeavor that requires a lot of strategy. The focus right now probably needs to be more on prevention. I mean, most of the people that come into our programs are, pretty much already in the fight of their lives. And so we know that they are more vulnerable. And so maybe, taking more of a move towards preventing, the engagement with some of these groups might be the way to go.
Okay. We're coming right down to the end here, and we kind of had to shift everything around because of some tech issues. John Clark, I want to give you a chance to chime in here and take us through some final thoughts here. I mean, if you were to help solve the situation, what would you do?
I'd start with the candid conversation, Steve. I read Task Force 1, the report that came out, and they've already added the word respect. And I think this is the wrong move. We continue to use these euphemisms when we really need to have the conversation about racism. We need to have a conversation about race. The word Black, white, Mexican, when these words come up, people start to get uncomfortable. We need to have these uncomfortable types of conversations if we're going to move the ball further down the field. It affects our neighborhoods, it affects our Navy, and it affects our nation, as we've talked about here today. I don't think we should start substituting these terms. We did it with unconscious bias. It's not unconscious, and it's not a bias. It's flat out racism. We showed a picture earlier of the highest levels of our military leaders in the Oval Office. When you look at that picture, there's 23 people in the room. I believe 22 are white men. There's one Black man, and there's one woman. That does not happen by accident. And until we're willing to admit that to ourselves and figure out where it's at, Task Force 1 has a bunch of these, what I call brick ideas. When you build a wall to somewhere or keeping someone out, it's the mortar that matters. It's the mortar that keeps the bricks together or allows them to fall apart. So Task Force 1 has a bunch of bricks to it and what I'm talking about is legislating behavior, but it's the attitude and the mindsets of people that you have to get to. And someone alluded to it earlier, actually a couple of our panelists, if you scratch the surface of a cynic, you'll usually find an idealist, somebody along the way who something happened to them and they said, you know what, we should really be doing this. And it didn't happen the way that they thought or that it could have happened.
So do you think the veteran community is prepared to do that? Unlike the active duty, they're still struggling with this notion, but at least they're talking about it. Are they even talking about this in the veteran community?
Absolutely. I think the general American public is not aware of how much the veteran community influences the active duty community, especially at the senior levels. Those retired admirals and generals, they're the tribal leaders. If you go back to time and infinitum, You know, it was the councils that brought up the younger ones, and the younger ones became the older ones. And then as they become older, they teach the younger ones. Well, we can't seem to get past the fact that, you know what, there are competent people of color. And that does start in the veteran community. It starts with mentoring. As I mentioned earlier, at the Naval Postgraduate School Alumni Association, they have an all-white advisory council.
And that's the thing that has to change. John, I'm going to have to, you're getting the last word on this. I'm going to have to thank my guest, Richard Brookshire with the Black Veterans Project, John Clark III, recently retired naval commander, Tony McAleer. His book is A Cure for Hate. Pete Simi, professor at sociology at Chapman University, and Akila Templeton, CEO of Veterans Village. KPBS will continue to track this story. You can find our ongoing coverage at kpbs.org/military. And thanks to the American Homefront and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting for supporting this event and our independent reporting. I'm Steve Walsh. Thanks for joining us, and please have a good night.